In September of 2020, the Maryland Office of the Inspector General for Education, or OIGE, began an investigation into the allegations of grade changing throughout Baltimore City Public Schools, BCPS. For years, whistleblowers had come forward with claims that schools were cheating on statewide assessments, graduating ineligible students, and maintaining inaccurate enrollment numbers. These more recent problems follow an almost 200-year battle over education in Maryland. The battle concerns not only the integrity of the current education system, but also the reality of a system which claims to provide equal opportunity to all. You are watching Black Belief. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so that you never miss a new video. The OIGE report, released on June 7, 2022, reveals a culture of fear and a veil of secrecy within the Baltimore City Public Schools system. Through a review of school records and interviews with BCPS headquarters staff, the OIGE identified 10 schools with the highest number of grade changes from failing to passing between 2016 and 2020. The OIGE decided to focus only on the grades of high school students. The organization declined to review scores for 2020 to 2021 school year when BCPS decided to advance all students in recognition of the many issues associated with virtual learning. The school with the most grade changes was Patterson High School, which accounted for 47% of all of the grade changes reviewed. In fact, over 80% of Patterson's failing grades were changes to meet the minimum passing grade of 60%. Staff members reported that spreadsheets of failing grades and pre-signed grade change forms were emailed to them by the principal, and they were pressured to submit the change request to North Avenue, a term used to refer to BCPS headquarters. In other cases, investigators found that staff were following an older practice, which allowed grade changes to occur with only a single signature from the school's principal or their designee. In effect, this older process gave the principal sole discretion over grade changes. In October of 2019, regulations were changed and schools were required to provide an explanation for each grade change, a signature from the teacher requesting the change, and a signature from the school's principal or their designee. The investigation also differentiated grade changes due to extended teacher absences or teacher career changes. Schools use a program called Infinite Campus, or IC, to enter student grades. Only the teacher of record for a class can enter grades for that class in the system. If the assigned teacher is not present, a substitute teacher will make a written record of student grades. At the end of the year, the designated grade reporter at the school will be required to reconcile the written and electronic records. This process often led to several grade updates in IC at the end of the year, which were recorded as grade changes, but happened as a result of staffing issues. Similar situations could occur for missing grades. If a student completed work at the end of the year, populating a missing grade after the reporting deadline would also be recorded in IC as a grade change. During several interviews, officials claimed that they did not feel there was any pressure on teachers or principals to change grades. But investigative reports from the local Fox 45 news station told a different story. Starting in 2021, the outlet published various segments about schools improperly changing grades and counting students who were no longer actually enrolled. In March of 2021, Fox 45 published a story about a student who passed only 3 classes in 4 years and, despite having a .13 GPA, was ranked in the top half of his class. In another report from September 15, 2021, former principal Angel Lewis claimed that she was fired after complaining about so-called ghost students and ghost classes. Lewis sued BCPS for wrongful termination, claiming that they had violated whistleblower protection laws. She claimed that administrators wanted to keep students on the rolls in order to increase the amount the school would receive in taxpayer funding. Lewis also claimed that her school was cheating on statewide assessments and graduating ineligible students. These news stories, as well as other anonymous allegations, informed the OIGE's investigation. Fox 45 is one of the many local news outlets that are owned by Sinclair Broadcasting Group. Sinclair Broadcasting was started as Chesapeake Television Corporation by Julian Sinclair Smith. Its first station was WBFF in Baltimore in 1971. In 1986, Julian and his sons consolidated independent stations in Baltimore, Pittsburgh, and Cleveland and renamed the company to Sinclair Broadcasting Group. The corporation has continued to expand by buying and merging with smaller media companies. In the early 2000s, observers accused the network of actively favoring conservative political positions. Liberal news outlets have reported on meetings between David Smith, son of Julian Smith and chairman of Sinclair, and former President Donald J. Trump. They have also noted how news segments seem to echo Republican or Trump campaign messaging. Sinclair Broadcasting Group is the largest owner of local TV news stations in the country. Most of the stories about the BCPS scandals came from Fox 45. These dynamics of the educational situation in Maryland and the alleged politics of its critics heightened tensions. A majority Black school district run by majority Black leadership is at the center of discussions around academic failure and mismanagement. The partisan nature of the discussion makes it difficult to separate fact from fiction. The situation mirrors over 100 years of Maryland politics. The fight over education for Black students in Maryland can be split into three efforts. The first effort was for Black control of Black schools. In 1826, the Maryland Assembly created white-only schools. Black leaders created the Colored Sabbath School Union of Baltimore, which opened 15 schools for Black students. 3 months before the 13th Amendment was ratified, Maryland adopted a new constitution which abolished slavery. The same year, the Baltimore Association for the Moral and Intellectual Improvement of the Colored People was established with funding from Quakers and other abolitionist groups. The organization created about 40 schools for Black students, but only white teachers were employed. The city council first began donating to the schools before eventually taking over their management completely in 1867. City leaders believed that Black people weren't capable of completing the same educational requirements as whites. They believed that Black students were best suited for menial, low-wage jobs. Therefore, they believed additional education was a waste of resources. A new cohort of Black religious leaders, teachers, attorneys, and other activists disagreed. They saw the schools as a place where Black students could build self-esteem and group solidarity. They knew that Black teachers were critical to instilling the values of Black racial uplift that were popular at the time. The Black leaders started the Colored Teachers for Colored Students movement, which combined the existing moderate approach of petition and letter writing with confrontational tactics like lawsuits and protests. In 1887, the city council agreed to allow Black teachers to teach in all Black schools. However, they included the stipulation that Black teachers and white teachers could not work at the same schools. This meant that the existing all Black schools that already had all white staff would not be able to hire new Black teachers. Black teachers would only be able to work at newly built all Black schools. At the turn of the 20th century, political power in Baltimore shifted from Republicans to a new coalition of so-called progressive Democrats, and opposition to Black teachers at all Black schools decreased. By 1907, all of Baltimore's Black-only schools were staffed exclusively with Black educators. Eventually, there were 2 all-Black high schools, the Colored High and Training School, which would later be renamed to Frederick Douglass High School, and Paul Laurence Dunbar High School. Douglass served Black students from West Baltimore, while Dunbar served Black students from East Baltimore. It became clear to the Black community that the underlying racial caste system would not allow for equality to ever truly exist. The second educational fight would be the one to end segregation in education completely. One notable alumni of Frederick Douglass High School would play a pivotal role in dismantling this caste system. Thurgood Marshall was born in Baltimore, Maryland in 1908. After high school, he went to Lincoln University in Pennsylvania, where he graduated with honors. Afterwards, Marshall applied to Howard University's law school. Black students were prohibited from attending the University of Maryland's law school at the time. In law school, Marshall studied under Charles Hamilton Houston, an advocate for a concept called social engineering, which encouraged lawyers to use the law to fight for civil rights. Houston was a prominent example of the power of Black educators. As a graduate of Amherst University and Harvard University Law School, Charles Houston was recruited by Mordecai Johnson, the first Black president of Howard University. He used his position as vice dean and later dean of Howard's Law School to mentor a generation of Black lawyers. He updated the school's curriculum and secured accreditation from the Association of American Law Schools and the American Bar Association. Houston would later be known as the man who killed Jim Crow. He believed that by focusing on how the status quo violated the separate but equal framework, states could be forced to either build equal educational institutions for Black students or integrate existing all-white facilities. Thurgood Marshall graduated first in his class from Howard University Law School and passed the bar the same year. Both Marshall and Houston joined the NAACP and began working on various cases meant to challenge Jim Crow. In 1936, the duo worked for the legal department of the Baltimore NAACP and represented Donald Gaines Murray. Murray was rejected by University of Maryland Law School because of his race. Though the law school agreed to help Murray study at another law school, even one that was out of state, the NAACP legal team argued that out-of-state legal education would not properly prepare students to practice law in Maryland. They also pointed out that Maryland had not built an all-Black law school in the state. Therefore, they concluded, the state of Maryland was failing to provide separate and equal education to Black law students. A Maryland Circuit Court agreed and ordered the University of Maryland Law School to admit Donald Murray. Seeing the need for a legal organization to assist with the growing number of cases across the country, Thurgood Marshall founded the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, or NAACP-LDF, a completely separate organization from the NAACP with separate funding and leadership. The Legal Defense Fund used the same strategy from the Murray case to force the University of Maryland School of Nursing to accept Black students in 1950 and the Baltimore Polytechnic Institute to accept Black students in 1952. Eventually, the work of the Legal Defense Fund culminated in a massive victory. In 1954, the United States Supreme Court ruled that separate but equal educational facilities for racial minorities were inherently unequal and unconstitutional, in the case of Brown versus Board of Education. While there was resistance in many states, integration would soon become the norm. Black and white students finally could attend the same schools and access the same opportunities. It may have seemed to observers at the time that the final battle had been won. By the 1980s, though, the third fight emerged. Integrated schools still did not guarantee adequate or equal funding for schools. In many industrial northern cities, companies moved to the suburbs along with a large part of the white population. Eventually, many manufacturing operations were moved overseas. These cities were left with a population of students who were increasingly more likely to live at or below the poverty line, more likely to have disabilities, and more likely to be English language learners. The cities had less money in tax dollars to serve students who had more special needs. In 1983, Baltimore City and other Maryland school systems with lower levels of wealth sued the state based on the argument that their students were not receiving an equal education. While the Maryland Court of Appeals stated that states are not required to provide equal funding to each of their school districts, the court ruled that the Constitution guarantees a thorough and efficient education, meaning one that is adequate by contemporary educational standards. Starting in 1994, the ACLU filed Bradford versus Maryland State Board of Education on behalf of Baltimore parents and students, which sought to force the state of Maryland to provide the thorough and efficient education required by the appeals court. The Bradford case worked its way through the court system over the next 30 years. There were victories in 1996, 1999, and 2000. During this period, the court ruled that Baltimore City schools were constitutionally inadequate. The plaintiffs in the state of Maryland entered into a consent decree, whereby a board of school commissioners was established to manage the schools. Commissioners were appointed by the governor and mayor. $230 million over 5 years was allocated. and later $49.7 million was secured to provide more funding to Baltimore City schools. Even after these funding efforts, a judge ruled that an additional $2,000 to $2,600 per student was needed. In 2002, in response to the court's order to provide additional funding, Maryland passed the Bridge to Excellence in Public Schools Act, which increased statewide educational funding by $1.3 billion, $250 million of which would go specifically to BCPS over 8 years. But problems emerged in 2004. Before the Bridge Act funding could kick in, a $58 million deficit was discovered in BCPS, triggering an increase in class sizes, the elimination of summer schools, and cutbacks on other supportive services. The plaintiffs in Bradford petitioned the court again for relief. Once again, the court agreed that Maryland had failed to properly allocate the $2,000 to $2,600 per student, and that BCPS had been underfunded by an amount ranging from $439 million to over $800 million between the years of 2001 and 2004. When the Great Recession happened in 2007, the Maryland Assembly discontinued the annual inflation factor that was originally included in the Bridge Act. This meant that funding to Baltimore schools would remain flat for the following years, compounding the underfunding that had been identified by the courts. The ACLU continued to fight. In the 2010s, the organization tried to propose a financial model aimed at allocating funds for the renovation and remodeling of Baltimore schools. This financing model was accepted and passed into law, leading to the opening of 13 modernized schools in 2017, 2018, and 2020. Despite continued legislative efforts to rebuild schools, around 90 Baltimore school buildings were still in poor condition as of 2021. The ACLU and Legal Defense Fund sought further relief through the Bradford case in 2019. Maryland still had not fully funded Baltimore schools despite several commissions, independent audits, and court rulings which found chronic underfunding. For example, in 2016, research consultants working with the Maryland Department of Education reported a funding gap of $358 million for BCPS and a $2.9 billion gap statewide. On March 3, 2023, the court ruled in favor of the state of Maryland in a blow to Baltimore parents and students. In contradiction with previous rulings, the court held that the Maryland Constitution only requires an effort by the state to at most provide a basic education. The court further states that school funding is a political question that should be decided by state legislatures. The OIGE concluded that there was misunderstanding, misapplication, and non-compliance of grade change procedures, which could significantly impact graduation rates. The investigative team recommended an independent performance audit of BCPS to evaluate the efficiency and effectiveness of selected function areas related to the governance and administration of grading policies and procedures. An audit performed in 2024 by Alvarez and Marsal found no evidence of widespread grade manipulation in city schools during the prior year. Unlike the OIGE investigation, the audit reviewed grades for all levels K through 12. Out of 250,445 of the total grade changes recorded in IC, the auditors found that 4,091 of these changes were outside of the grading window and required approval. These changes affected 2,678 students. 3,463 grades, or 85% of those grades that required approval, were changed from null to pass, meaning that the grade was missing and inputted later. Only 4 grades were changed from pass to fail. The majority of these null to pass changes occurred for students in pre-K to 5th grade. Additionally, 70% of the final grades after these changes were A's or B's. All 4 of the grade changes from pass to fail happened in high schools. From these and other insights, the auditors identified that timely entry of grades in elementary schools was the real problem. They recommended that schools strengthen monitoring programs and update the grading and reporting policy. It seemed that the grade changing problem in high schools was resolved in just 2 years. Case closed. But was this true? The reason the issue was highlighted in the first place was because the grade changes were registered in IC. If grades are changed before being entered in IC or changed before the deadline, the system would not register that a grade was changed at all. Additionally, the question of how well the students are learning the material and whether they are truly prepared for collegiate level work, trade school, or entry-level employment still remains. Graduation rates alone are not a valid indicator of whether graduates have achieved proficiency in required subjects. Many would assume that the motive for passing students who may not be proficient is the desire to maintain a certain number of students at a school in order to retain school funding. A review of the professional salary schedules for Maryland educators between 2018 and 2024 shows that while some Maryland school districts pay principals based on the size of their school, Baltimore City schools do not. Furthermore, if principals were paid per student, then it would be more advantageous to fail students and force them to repeat classes until they age out of the traditional high school system to maximize class sizes. Perhaps the answer lies with how administrators themselves are evaluated. Principals and assistant principals are evaluated on several criteria, including student learning objectives or SLOs, the school performance measure SPM, and the leadership framework. Principals are also evaluated based on responses to a Staff 360 feedback survey. For principals, the feedback survey is worth 10% of their final evaluation. The school performance measure is worth 15%. The SLOs are worth 35%, and the leadership framework is worth 40%. For assistant principals, the end-of-year leadership framework is worth 50% instead of 40%, and no feedback survey is required. SLOs are defined as measurable academic goals for a particular group of students, anchored in available student data. The school performance measure reflects a whole school's year-long performance for learning environment, student growth, and college and career readiness. Combined, these two metrics are worth 45% of a principal's final rating. Since SLOs and school performance are heavily weighted in administrator assessments, this could be the reason that principals and assistant principals would seek to maintain 4-year and 5-year graduation rates at their schools. Mass grade changes and a large increase in the graduation rate would be suspicious, but ensuring that graduation rates don't fall too far would go unnoticed as long as passing grades were entered into IC before the deadline. The final ratings for principals and assistant principals are private and not available to the public. Defenders of BCPS point to the fight for equal funding as the real reason for poor student outcomes. They contend that the continuous focus on the corruption of individual school officials and scandals like the one about grade changes are an attempt to deflect responsibility from the state to the parents and the students. They also highlight the fact that even those who manage to graduate from BCPS and attend college have few job opportunities available. This, they say, creates an entrenched cycle of poverty that cannot be disrupted even by adequately funding the schools. Critics of BCPS say that the district doesn't have a funding problem, but has a spending problem. They point to the 3-person Office of Equity, which paid salaries of over $200,000 to each employee. The office's director is paid over $140,000. Or they point out the $1 million spent on the BCPS Achievement and Accountability Office, which includes $100,000 in salary for all of its employees. Furthermore, they ask why the chief executive officer makes over $300,000 a year, the chief of schools makes over $200,000 a year, and the chief communications and community engagement officer earned just over $190,000 a year. In fact, all officers of BCPS make over 6 figures. Meanwhile, the results of statewide assessments have been underwhelming. While proficiency rates have improved in 2024, all rates for BCPS academic assessments are still below statewide averages. In reality, BCPS issues are both a spending and a funding problem. Many BCPS school buildings still have leaking ceilings, asbestos, lead in drinking fountains, piles of rodent droppings, and unsanitary bathrooms, despite some successful school renovations. In the cold, many schools go without heat. In the summer, some schools must be shut down due to lack of air conditioning. Even getting to school is a challenge. Many BCPS students have to take public transportation to school. When some bus drivers skip stops or a train is delayed, students are more likely to be late to school. BCPS students have a childhood poverty rate that is 3 times that of other large Maryland districts. The lack of funding in housing, public transportation, and other public services shows up in the educational outcomes. Spending on bureaucracy, short-term funding bills, dead-end investigations are all meant to mask this reality. The high-paid administrators are there to manage the underfunded school system, to ensure that the graduation rates and dropout rates remain stable and do not cause alarm. There's little curiosity about the actual outcomes students experience 5, 10, 15 years after high school graduation. As individuals, many principals want to help, but by the time students reach high school, there is little they can do. As the OIGE reported, misunderstandings and misapplications of procedure break the facade and reveal the depth of neglect happening for Baltimore citizens. From the perspective of the courts, the legislature, and the oversight committees, no structural changes are needed. The system is working exactly as it was designed.